Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. Thank you very much for coming on. And it's M.E. Tori, and you're the writer of Fox Creek. Is that all correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I'll consider this part of the podcast a success, and from here on out, we'll just be good. We'll just be good. And so, how are you today, or this morning for you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Yeah, and it's nice to have you. So thank you very much for coming on. Um, just before we get into the book, where was growing up for you?
Various places. I was actually born in Washington State in a town called Wenatchee, which is nestled in the Cascade Mountain Range. But then at the age of, I think, just one and a half, my father was able to become a teacher with the Department of Defense. And so we moved to England. And I spent 10 years actually growing up in England and France and Germany. And then the rest of my life has been here in Washington State.
Whereabouts in England were you?
I was in two places in England. My father, his first job was at Lakenheath Air Force Base, and we lived what we called on the economy, and that means you don't live on any kind of military base. You just live out wherever. And we lived in a little town called Cockfield on the Green.
Okay.
And then the second time I lived in England, I was much older, and we lived just outside of London. Actually, no, I went to school just outside of London, near High Wycombe,
Yeah.
and then lived in a small village called Henton, which was in Oxfordshire.
Okay. I'm in Wiltshire, Stonehenge.
Mhm. Oh, very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and you then did France and Germany as well.
France when I was very young. I don't really have much. That's where we actually went first from Wenatchee.
Yeah.
So I was a toddler and a 3-year-old and
Yeah.
so on. So I have a couple memories, but not much.
No.
And then I did junior high and high school in Heidelberg, Germany, which was a fantastic experience.
Yeah. I bet. Because
Yeah.
that's the nice thing. Because when my dad was in the army, so as a child, one of my best memories was a few years that we spent in Cyprus, and which would never have happened if it
Right.
wasn't for my dad being in the army. And as a kid, you don't really understand the significance of what you're doing. You-
I know, I know. My parents used to like to go sightseeing.
yeah,
And for me, hanging around with your family at a certain age is very boring, and you don't necessarily want to be with them. And I was that way, and I didn't understand what the appeal of all these different places was. And I had to grow into that. And in a way, I had to grow into that in retrospect. So looking back, appreciated so much of what I had and so much of what I had experienced, such that as an adult, I'm a world traveler, and I just love visiting other parts of the world and spending a lot of time usually just in one place, just kind of soaking it in. I just love that.
yeah. It is nice. It is. If you people get the opportunity to travel, some of the best places I've ever travelled to are not tourist spots.
Right. Yep.
And you'll find some like really nice church in the middle of nowhere, or
Yeah.
a bar in an old building. It's been it's been a bar for 800 years or something, and yeah, but the genuinely the best places I've ever seen are not on a tourist map anywhere.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I usually go for a month at a time because I'm, I've got the time to be able to do that. And when I go, I might see a few tourist attractions here and there, but for the most part, I like to go out to the countryside and I
mm,
like to pick a place that's got a lot of walks and it's got the local bar, like you say, and the local village. And I just like to just experience that area. And I find that so fulfilling. I've seen a lot of big cities. I don't necessarily need to see too many
yeah,
more,
yeah. I'm
at
not.
least not for long.
Yeah, I'm not anti cities. I'm not anti tourist attractions or anything like that. I've just
Yeah.
kind of because surf a lot, so we used to surf a lot, and so me
Very
and my
nice.
friend would just go in a van and like just drive across France, drive across Portugal, northern Spain.
Oh my.
We found ourselves last year. The surf wasn't looking too good, so we went over to the other side of France, to the Jura region, just below the Alps, and then dropped down, caught a ferry to Corsica and stuff like that. But it's just unscripted, and you just kind of go
Yeah.
where you feel like it. And because of that, you're just rocking up somewhere, and one day you might be camping on a big campsite, the other day, 2 days later, it'll be a farmer's field. And yeah, you
Yeah.
just don't know who you're going to bump into, or what you discover. And like I said, I just found that nothing against big tourist attractions or anything like that, but some of the best places I've ever been to are just not tourist attractions. They just, as I'm saying it, I remember when I was in the Jura region, we walked from the campsite, and my friend Duncan, who was with, had this great idea. Let's walk to the village, the local town. It's a few miles. It'll kill 45 minutes, and it was just like, yeah. I wasn't that keen, to be honest. It was all uphill. But one of the best things just most beautiful things I've ever seen is we were walking along this kind of, it's just a back road that's barely even a road, that becomes almost inaccessible except for walking. And as we're going past someone's random garden, they had like this mountain stream waterfall that just dropped into their garden and just scurried out under the bridge we were walking. And they were like, it was an old mill or something that somebody had renovated.
Yeah.
And I swear this is one of the most beautiful properties I've ever seen in my life.
Right.
And I was just like, how did this, how? I just walked around a corner, up a footpath.
Right.
And it was just the way this, yeah, it's priceless, absolutely priceless.
Yeah.
But
You can't plan that.
absolutely, and there just no idea that it would be there, and
Right.
this person has no idea that I've spent 10 minutes just staring at his garden.
Or maybe they did, and they're like, ugh.
Yeah, oh God,
tree.
here's another tourist. But yeah, so it's traveling is nice, and you, like you say, if you get the time and you can just walk out of the cities, you can kind of immerse yourself into something a little different.
Right.
So from childhood and moving around Europe, what happened next?
I moved back to Washington State and got married at a very young age. I will have to say, I felt coming back to Washington State after so many years in Europe, I very much felt like a duck out of water. I had a different vocabulary than my friends, different taste in music, different clothes. And so moving back, it was odd and I felt out of place. It wasn't too surprising that I fell into a relationship right away. I wish I hadn't, but I wouldn't be the person I am today and I wouldn't have my kids today. So, it is what it is.
Yeah.
So I got married, and by the age of 23, I actually had three little boys, and then I got divorced. So it was a very rough time for me. And after my divorce, I decided to go to college. So I did everything in reverse.
Yeah, but we can't map it out, can we?
No.
One of the biggest problems is if we all knew what we were supposed to be doing, we'd never make a mistake, we'd never make an error. And some of the best so-called mistakes or errors had the best outcomes.
Right.
It is,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the rule. The world is cruel like that. It's, I've offered a friend of mine, my best friend from school. He always said, he said, you can't find yourself if you don't get a little lost.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I used to have that written on my wall in my office because it just helped me.
Oh, that's a good one.
When sort of like your mind's sort of doubting everything, just like, well, this is how you find yourself. This is
Right.
and but yeah, it's it's so. So how old are your kids now then?
My oldest is 45 now. So that just kind of blows me away. And then I have my other two will one has a birthday in 2 days, he'll be 43, and the other one has a birthday in 5 days, and he'll be 44. They were Irish twins.
Irish twins. Yeah. It's but no, it's nice. Do you have any grandchildren?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I have three. My oldest grandchild, she's in college. And then my youngest is a grandson. He's only 5.
Oh,
So
nice! What a
good.
wonderful age.
Yeah, yeah.
That,
It's a lot of fun, all of them.
but that toddler age, I think, is the
Yeah,
best age for having grandchildren or nieces. In my
pretty
case, nieces
fun.
and nephews. Yeah,
Yeah,
when they're that sort of like 3 to about 7 or 8,
right.
it's just the best. After that, they start growing up too much.
Yeah.
You know, and have you always been keen on writing?
Uh, I think I can identify that starting in the 5th grade is when I said it to myself. Oh, I'm a writer. Before that, I was more of a reader, a voracious reader, reading novels, for kids by the time I was in 3rd grade. And then by the time I was in 5th, 6th grade, I started gravitating toward Jane Eyre and more novels written for adults. Read Gone with the Wind when I was in 7th grade, that kind of thing. But in 5th grade, what happened was I wrote a story, and my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Bazitis, decided to have that story published in the school newspaper and just, told me, good job,
Oh,
and
nice.
I felt like, in a sense, I had kind of like this literary breakthrough. I still remember feeling that way while I was writing it. And so from then on, I thought, I'm a writer. And she really was a very encouraging teacher. So kudos to her.
Yeah, that's nice. That
And
is.
yeah. And I've actually met with her multiple times as an adult. And, I used to have a career for 20 years writing for children. And I had a book signing once in a bookstore in Seattle. And she came to one of my book signings, which I thought
Yeah,
was,
that's beautiful.
it was full circle. It really was. It was wonderful. So I've been able to include her in that part of my life. And that was wonderful. She has since passed. And so, but she's there somewhere watching.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but then going into high school, focusing on creative writing, same in college. And then as a young adult, tried to write some short stories and send them off and get published, but they were truly awful. And in a sense, even though you may take creative writing, let's say at university, it doesn't necessarily prepare you for the market of fiction
Yeah.
writing. And I think, in a sense, those are very two different things. One is about marketability, and the other one is about, rendering the perfect sentence. So, so I really fell flat on my face, kind of put it aside for a while. And it wasn't until, I'd say my 40s that I decided I would. It was actually when my kids were in high school, and I decided to be a stay-at-home mom. And so then I thought, well, okay, if I don't know what I'm doing, why don't you learn how? So I checked out books from the library on how to do this and that. And then I went to continuing education courses at my local college in the evening. I went to writers' conferences and things like that. And one of the, not only learning that way, but one of the ways that I started really learning was I would take a super good book that I admired, how the author had written that book, and I would open it and find a scene, and I would say, okay, how did the author construct this scene? How did they start it? Where did we go from there? Did we start here and then go to backstory and then come back to where we were? Did we go to different points of view? Did we move out in point of view and then come in closer? How did all those things work? So my books would have, jottings in the margin in pencil of, and really I started deconstructing these novels to figure out how to do it. And then I would try to put it in practice. And that's when I started being successful in publishing.
So that's a lot of almost. I was about to say engineering. It's
Yeah,
really,
yeah, really.
yeah, really kind of like you're saying, the opposite of what they teach you to do, because they're actually,
Yeah,
you're looking at something, as you said, deconstructing it,
right.
and kind of refitting the parts to see how it works. And they didn't really teach you
Yeah.
that when you're writing.
No, they absolutely don't. And point of view is one of my like platforms in a sense, because when we hear point of view, having taken English courses or whatever, we think, okay, there's first person, there's second person, third person, that kind of thing. But point of view is one of the most essential skills to learn as a writer, and you don't understand what it means until you break all the rules about point of view and you wonder why your story isn't working. And it's only when you master point of view that you're able to manipulate a scene any way you want it and make it work. It's really incredible. And if there's any wannabe writers out there that are listening, a book I would recommend is called Characters and Viewpoint by Orson Scott Card. And that book, I dissected that book and took to heart everything he said, and I learned so much. He approached it kind of like being, how would I say, being a film director. Okay, you're the director. You want to show this expression or you want to show this scene from this character's point of view. Where are you going to put your cameras? How far away are your cameras going to be? That kind of thing. And so he would talk about camera work and how that is the same as, writing your scene. You start out here, you have a big authorial voice, you move in a little closer, okay, closer yet, and now you're in the character's head and you're hearing the character's thoughts. So that's what I mean by point of view. It was very, very difficult to understand, but once I cracked the code, thanks to Orson Scott Card, it was an amazing breakthrough.
When you said that point of view, it reminded me of an interview I seen with the actor Christoph Waltz, who played
Oh, yeah.
the German Hans Lander in Inglourious Bastards. And
Hmm.
he was asked by a reporter, like, this point, this how he was so chilling, the character, he's so evil, blah, blah, blah. And, how did you get into that frame? And he said, what do you mean
Wow.
he was evil? He said, well, blah, blah. And he said, he didn't think he was evil. He thought he was a good
Oh,
person. And
yeah.
and he was just, and everyone's like that. It's like, oh, hang on a second. But because you're spotting his point of view, Christoph
Right.
Waltz, knew the character. He thought he was in the right. He thought he was doing good work.
Right.
Everyone else perceived him as be just the embodiment of being evil. And that's why the
Yes.
character was so successful, and the way he played him. He
Right.
just played him as
Right.
going around killing people. It's, hey,
Right.
it's a good day's work.
I've done great, great stuff for the Nazi cause.
But this is the
Yay me.
that there is but this is what people, like you said, when you're saying about point of view, it's understanding. You can't write an evil character. You've got to understand that character thinks they're
Right.
doing good work. There was
Right.
I think he was Polish, and he basically, if there was a world record, holds the world record for assassinating people, because he worked
Oh,
out. He did 12-hour shifts, and he worked out a way to load and reload handguns that he could shoot somebody every minute or every 30 seconds. And he was just incredibly efficient. And they said it's because he enjoyed it, and he worked out how to be incredibly efficient at it. And but when you say it like that, it's such a really evil. But if you look at it from a point of production, from somebody who's like, I really love my work, and skips through to the
right.
office door, like, hey, what's the list? Are they queued up? Are they ready? Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah,
We're laughing, but
but
yeah,
no, but that's the thing. It's
critical.
horrifying. It's horrifying
Yeah,
that
it's
he,
critical, I think, in really successful movies or literature
yeah,
to have that kind of point of view, because then you start really understanding those kind of mindsets and that worldview. And it's not easy. It's not black. It's not white. It's not totally evil or totally good. It's those gray areas that are so difficult to quantify. And in my book, Fox Creek, which is about the American slaveholding South, I some of my point of view characters are the slaveholders. And I purposefully did not think of them, let's say, oh, I'm going to now do the point of view from this evil person. I didn't do that. I said, what does this person believe? What do they believe? What do they like?
Mm.
What do they enjoy? And how do they see their life? And do they think of themselves as a moral person? And then I write from that point of view. And I don't overlay my judgment on that. I let the reader decide for themselves what they think about that. Just like the viewers viewing Inglorious Bastards.
Yeah. Well, because this is the thing I've had trouble when explaining to people, is one of the biggest issues that film, literature, or just in general is we view things from today as if, and it's like, no, that was the norm. It was
Right.
it was normal, and it was normal across the globe. Nobody thought owning anyone was a bad thing. That's the reason we have so much history on it, is because we only look at it from the point that the turning of attitude started to change. Up until then, nobody had a problem with it anywhere in the world.
Right.
It's just, but attitudes started to change, and people started to say, hang on, we shouldn't own other human beings.
Right.
And that's when you have all of these historical contexts of the evil.
Right.
Nobody mentions it before. Nobody mentions the Arab slave trade. Nobody mentions the enslavement of Italians, the Slavics, the Irish. Do you know what I mean? None of it. It's throughout Europe, throughout the continent of Africa and South America. There is nowhere native Indians had slaves. Everybody.
Right. Exactly.
But the
Yes.
history changes when somebody somewhere, and it was a movement that rapidly spread across the earth. It doesn't seem like it was rapid, but in terms of the history it was. And
Right.
that's when you get the clashes. You get two different thoughts where one is like, no, this is the norm, and the other people are saying, but it shouldn't be. We should be doing better than this.
Right. Right. I'm always suspicious of people who say, they say it in all honesty and good for them, but they say, well, if I'd have lived back then, I never would have owned slaves. And I'm very suspicious of that. I'm like, well, really? Because if you read the literature from back then, especially the diaries, the letters, and the journals, so you're reading primary materials of people who actually experienced this and lived back then, what was happening? What was happening was the culture of the American South, and I'm going to limit this to the American South. It was absolutely acceptable to own slaves. In fact, it was a status symbol. Why was it a status symbol? Because they were expensive. An adult male slave in his prime, at the height of the slave trade, would sell between 1,000 to 1,200 US dollars, which in today's money is about 44 to 45,000 US dollars. So even if you owned just one slave, that's, oh man, you could walk around going, yeah, I've kind of made it here. And then imagine if you own 10 slaves or 50 or 100. You do that, you're at the top of your pinnacle of society, of white society. And we're not that different today. Do we
No.
strive to be at the pinnacle of our society? Most of us do. We want to be accepted by our peers. Very, very few of us are able to step back from what is culturally acceptable and say, well, wait a second here. That's wrong. And here's why I think it's wrong. Very few of us are able to do that. And really who would have been able to do that if you were born and raised in that culture in the American South? I think very few of us. There were people who were able to do that, but not many.
Because there's an interesting statistic from the Roman Empire. The around central Rome, about 40 to 50% of the people were slaves.
Yeah.
So, and And the reason I say that is because people don't think of the institutions and the foundations that these beliefs were built on. It wasn't an overnight thing. So like you're saying, it's when you take the Deep South and the status that comes, which basically says to everybody, "How look at me, how this is how wealthy I am," and that's important, especially in a country that's new, and
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
and you've left, most of them in some respect have left Europe and entered the United States, or back then wasn't even the United States yet, I don't think. And they've left aristocracy behind because they might not have been aristocrats. They might not have, so there isn't a class system that exists, but there's memories of how class systems haunted them, held them back, made them stay in their lane. And now I'm in America. I can be whoever I want. I can do whatever I want because I've got money and wealth and power and status. Is I now get to be the very thing that I might have fled from.
right. Yeah, that's a really good point. Um, the people who did settle the eastern seaboard and the areas up and around the Mississippi River, which were extremely fertile, they were more of the wealthy landowners, the aristocracy, if you will, of usually England, but in the case of Louisiana, which where my book is based, a lot of the French settled in that area. So you would have very wealthy people coming in, but they brought that wealth with them, and then they expected that same lavish
Yeah.
lifestyle. At the same time, you've got immigrants, like you say, who came with, nothing, but because the class system doesn't exist there the same way that it did where
Mm.
they came from, they're able to, let's say, fulfill the American dream. Well, how do you fulfill the American dream? Well, I look at my rich neighbors and they all own slaves.
Yeah.
So I'm going to earn my money. I'm going to buy my first slave, and I'm going to start, climbing toward the top. And that's what the model was based on.
What took your interest that you went down that road?
Well, it started, ever since I was little. First of all, I've had this passion for issues of peace and justice. And I think that's just been ingrained in me since I was small. Um, And then, I'm interested in history as well. So when my husband said, "Hey, I'm going to go to New Orleans. Do you want to come with me?" We live in Washington. And I said, "Sure, I'll come." I'd never been to the American South before. And so I was writing for children at that time. And I thought if I do some research before I go, maybe I can base a book there. So I came to New Orleans armed with some research, and I thought I would write a ghost story that takes place in New Orleans because it's a pretty haunted city. But nothing was coming together for me as I kind of explored the city. And so I rented a car, and I thought, as long as I'm here, I'm going to go north along the Mississippi, and I'm going to visit some of these plantations because I may never get a chance to visit them. Um, I go into these plantations on the tours, and as a northerner, I was expecting a very balanced tour of these were the white people, this is how they lived, and these were the slaves, and this is how they lived, and so on. And instead, it was a very whitewashed glorification of history. It was all about the white family, their ancestry, how they lived in lavish style, and not once were the slaves mentioned. And I was blown away by that and very angry. I didn't say anything, but I came home on fire. And my ghost story out the window, still haven't written it. Came home on fire, and I thought, okay, I need to write a story about the antebellum South, but I want to write it to where I have this intersection of the white narrative, which was, in their view, very wonderful, and then intersect that with the black narrative and the realities of what that was. And I then embarked on 3 years of full-time research, most of it ensconced in primary materials, the diaries, the letters, and so on, in archives or on microfiche. So it was it took a long time because as a Northerner, I wanted to represent the South in a way that felt authentic. And as a white person, I wanted to represent the Black narrative in a way that felt authentic and honored the Black voices of history as well.
What conclusion did you come to?
There was a vast spectrum of experiences, as you would expect. Actually, no, let me back up and say I think most people don't expect that there's a vast spectrum of experiences. I think most people see what they see in the movies and think it was all that way. And what I found was just like human beings are so diverse, the same was true with every single plantation and place that owned slaves. It was diverse. You had slave owners who considered themselves very gentle and benign, all the way to the psychopathic murderers who, like, slavery was their answer to prayer. Like,
Yeah.
this was their niche. And then everybody in between. And I would say for the most part, most slave owners and the slave experiences fell somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, kind of on your bell curve. And then the slave experiences, again, were this vast spectrum of experience. The colonial experience of slavery was perhaps more benign. They didn't have the rules and structure in place that became true and relevant in the antebellum era. The antebellum era just simply means pre-Civil War. In the pre-Civil War, they had structures in place. If you revolt, you're hanged. If you learn to read and write, you're either executed or you're sold. I mean, they just had all these rules. And the reason they had these rules is because they had learned from experience. And I say they, meaning the white owners, had learned from experience. If you give them too much room, they take advantage of it, and then bad things happen. So we're going to create all these rules to keep everybody in place. And so it became very structured. My What I was surprised at with how much I related to some of the slave owners who were talking. How I felt like if I were to meet them today, I would actually like them. And I thought, okay, this is critical because it means these were normal people.
Yeah.
And, it gets back to that question, would you really have owned slaves? I think, yeah, you know, because it was the normal thing to do and normal people were doing it. And so you read about people who were normal, who loved their families, who loved their children, who did their civic duty, who took care of neighbors when neighbors were in trouble, and, just out and out enjoyed fish fries, enjoyed
Yeah.
dancing. They were just likable people. And then at the same time, they're capable of hardening themselves to what's happening behind the scenes with their slave force and enforcing the rules. Like, did you run away? Okay, 50 lashes. Did you run away again? Okay, I'm going to let my dogs overhaul you, meaning I let my dogs loose on you. And that is said in the same breath with, oh, the weather was rainy. And I'm just struck with that. I could hardly put it together. But in my novel, Fox Creek, that's who I fashioned my main slaveholder after. It actually comes from this journal that I read called, let's see, Plantation Life in the Florida Parishes, 1843 to 1846. And the Florida parishes at that time were actually part of Louisiana. And his name was Bennett Barrow. And he was just this complex man. And I think all human beings are complex. None of us are stereotypes.
I think
So,
I think that's what people, like you say, people. I think what people don't understand is, which goes back to something I said earlier, is if you look at the history of humans through the lens of today, it's very blurred and it's extremely distorted. You have to really understand that once upon a time, the world was incredibly different, and owning something was the norm, and it was precious. And there were two things in life: it was either a commodity or something that cost me money. And if it costs me money, I don't need it. It either has value or it doesn't. And when you look at life, trying to understand life in that lens, I wouldn't say it gives you a clear picture, but it's that thing of we were talking about point of view. It helps you kind of understand the first sentences of what their day might be like if you were trying to write it down, because it's a very different world, and their point of view it's like you say, some slave owners were awful people, but they were awful whether they owned slaves or not. There wasn't an ounce of kindness or compassion, empathy in them. And then there were others who had empathy, had compassion, and would have treated their slaves accordingly, but within the realms of, well, if you break the rules, I have to be seen to punish you.
Right.
And then I don't know how true it was, but there's always kind of stories that pop out of slave owners that ended up in relationships with their slaves, but because of the times had to keep them hidden.
Right. I think that was done quite a bit, and to save face in society, it was done, elsewhere out of prying
Yeah,
eyes, and some people might have thought that that was okay, and others were appalled by it. I know that Bennett Barrow, who was a real man, he had opinions on everything, and his opinion on sexual relations with the slaves, he said, that's when a society will fall, is when you have an amalgamation between the races. He believed that you have a superior race and that they're served by the inferior race and that they shouldn't mix, which I thought was interesting. And so I gave my character that same
yeah,
worldview. But that's a kind of highfalutin worldview. And certainly not everybody felt that way, or they might have felt that way, but they were, too sexually driven to care about it awfully much.
yeah. And this is the thing, isn't it? Is that there's so much rightly so, there's so much passion attached to that history. But again, we attach it from the noose of a world that we don't know by today's standards, and I think it hangs us. I think it hangs people up in
Right.
trying to understand history. It's there is, I don't know. I think it's when I look at history and I see the way that people react to it is, I think you kind of, for it's a clumsy thing to say. You have a lot of first world problems because back then they had really serious problems, and they weren't worried about anybody's feelings, not even their neighbours, because they couldn't afford to be. And I don't know how, the way that you must have got into those characters to try and see their point of views, to write what their understanding of what they're doing to other people, to the point that that takes, that's a very, very different environment to the one you're in talking to me across a Zoom calling.
One of the moments that, as I'm reading Bennett Barrow's diary, one of the moments that just I went, oh my God, and it was very revealing to me, was he recounts, and this is after, 300 pages of reading his diary, he recounts a discussion that he had with his wife. He asked her, am I a good man? And she thought and looked at him and said, yes, I think you are. And he goes, I don't believe I've ever harmed anyone in my life. And I thought, okay, this is his view of himself, but he doesn't include how he treats his slaves into that equation. It's not even a part of the equation. And I thought that's critical in understanding his worldview.
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it, when you think about it?
It is.
Because that's
It
a
is.
diary you're reading. Somebody's written
Yeah.
a person.
Yeah.
It's not fiction.
Right.
It's
It's a journal. It was a plantation journal.
yeah.
So you'd have it by date, April 23rd, 1843. Cloudy today. I sent, 10 hands down to the, back 40
Mm.
to, Whole Cotton, whatever it might be. Yeah. It was very mundane for a lot of it. I got a nice glimpse into kind of the everyday rhythm of plantation life. And then every now and then punctuated like lightning bolts with violence and with sometimes comic episodes. It was very, very interesting to read.
Because this is the thing is when you kind of people can, writers, whatever, we can congratulate ourselves if we write a fictional character, and someone says, oh, the depth, the this, the that, but when you're reading something where somebody is actually with their own hand written, I've
Right,
harmed no one, no person,
right,
am I a good person? Oh, but I don't mean those people. They're not people. They're a commodity. They're
right,
they're not human. Yeah,
right.
and that's a
Yeah,
very, when you're seeing the pencil or the pen strokes, whatever it is, it's just like, this isn't made up. This is how somebody
no,
viewed his daily life. And like you say, it's an
right,
intimate conversation with his wife, where he's
right.
almost questioning, like when I get to the gate, St. Peter's gates and St. Peter's, have you been a good man? Yes, yes. I discussed it with the wife. The wife said I did a top job. It's great. You
You
harmed
did really
nobody.
good.
Never harmed anybody in your life. Do you know what I mean? Ask Jesus. Jesus will tell you. My heart is, and that's what he believed wholeheartedly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's incredible.
It is. It's just, and what did you learn? Was there anything that surprised you in the learning of all of this?
Well, I think that one episode was one of my big surprises. That was an epiphany. Um, and I will also just say briefly that the United States had a law at that time saying that blacks were only three-fifths of a human being. So, you could morally say, I've been a good person and believe that, according to the law anyway. Um, what else surprised me? I guess, uh, one thing that I want to bring out is that when I was reading about slaves, and trying to ascertain what their lives would have really been like. That was difficult because, like I had said, it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. So you're not going to read a diary like that. Okay, on this day we did this, on that day we did that. It doesn't exist from a slave. The only things that we have from slaves are uh, written by slaves who escaped, maybe a diary after they found their freedom, or an autobiography, such as Frederick Douglass. Um, and they had learned to read and write at some point in their lives. But they are a very unique subset in that they were human beings who decided, for whatever reason, they are not going to live under slavery and they will risk life and limb and perhaps even their family and perhaps leaving their family to be free. And so that's a very unique subset. And then the other subset that I was able to learn from comes from the 1930s when the America was going through a deep depression. And President Roosevelt at that time started something called the Federal Writers Project, which employed writers across the nation. To one of the projects that they did was they interviewed ex-slaves. just oral interviews. And so I read a lot of those oral interviews. But this is also a unique subset of slaves because, they were freed in 1865, and now it's 1930. Those people who are recounting it would have been children at that time. So
Yeah,
how would they be recalling their experience? Only as children would have recalled it. It could have been accurate. It might have been full of, oh, all we did was play, or,
yeah.
I was
They
sold from
they
my mother
weren't.
at a young
Yeah,
age.
yeah. They're
Yeah,
not farm
don't really know.
hands with hard labour in the
Right.
fields.
So we're missing the voices of
Yeah,
people who were born on a plantation, worked until they died. We don't have their voices. So I have to fill in the blanks. And that's very hard to do, and it's true of all scholars. We all had to fill in the blanks. There is nothing out there. So I guess what surprised me from the Federal Writers Project was the vast spectrum of recollection that these former slaves had. It was all the way from, oh, my life was great and nothing ever was bad, all the way to we were whipped every day, or it was horrible, you know, every cruelty you can think of, and everything in between. And every different kind of interpretation of those experiences. So I remember one conversation that somebody told a writer. They said, well, we were whipped, but I deserved every whipping I ever got. So that was one interpretation. And Stockholm syndrome, maybe. I'm not really sure, but the vast spectrum of experience and of interpretation of that experience was really eye-opening for me.
I it reminded me of a conversation. I think I had it on Monday with a friend of mine, and she's a bit younger than me. And we were talking about around the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. What we call corporal punishment was being outlawed, which means you could no longer in schools receive the cane,
Right.
the slipper, or be hit as corporal punishment in schools. But she didn't grow up in that era, but I did. And she was saying about, like, well, it must have been traumatic, etc., getting hit by. I said, no. Every kid on my street got hit by his parents. We didn't know any. I didn't think that I was being mistreated when Daniel next door
Same
also
here,
got the
same
same.
here.
Yeah, yeah,
We got our whippings,
yeah,
but that was true for all my friends
yeah.
too.
So there wasn't like you didn't think you were being mistreated. I still don't.
Right.
I will argue that I was not. It was fair. Everybody was treated the same. We all got a good hiding when we did something wrong. I said, I think the difference is that the emphasis was always, the way that I remember it is, the philosophy was almost, you're not in trouble because of what you've done, you're in trouble because you got caught doing it. And it was always, do you know, it's like punishment was because you've been caught. There was always kind of like this unwritten rule that, well, kids are kids, so they're going to misbehave, but smart kids don't get caught.
You sound like you would have been a troublemaker.
I was
Were
a lot.
you?
I would say I was a lot of fun to be around, but you didn't want to get
Okay.
caught.
Yeah.
And it's like you say, is one story is, no, we had a great time. Another story is, no, we got whipped every day, but that was life.
Yeah.
And depending on how they perceived it, again, that point of view, which is really important,
Right.
they saw that as a norm, and hey, it's okay. Which kind of, again, reflects what you were saying about the stories you were reading. Was it 1835 or 18? The diaries?
1930. Oh, the diaries were from a variety of eras,
But
but
uh,
Arrow's diary, 1843,
yeah,
1846.
but you were saying that the stories about the slave, some were treated really well, some were treated horribly, and
Yeah.
then you jump forward 100 years, 200 years, some were treated really well and had great memories, some were treated horribly. There wasn't a norm. It was,
Right.
and that just seems to be that kind of cliche that human beings, there's a group of human beings that are just do incredibly compassionate things, And then there's a group of human beings that just seem to be able to do incredibly evil things.
Yeah. I will say, I agree with you. I will say that the institution of slavery, and anytime people are given carte blanche
Yeah.
uh, ownership over other people, it does degrade them.
Yeah.
It Yeah, it degrades them. And I read one particular diary that I read. It was by Tryphena Fox, who's actually a relative of mine. Her middle name is Torrey, Torrey, and I thought, oh no, is she related? But anyway, she was a northern woman who grew up without slavery, married a southern gentleman. I don't know if he's a gentleman, but a southern man who had some means. She goes down to live in one of the southern states. I can't remember where. And she had about three slaves under her direction. And I think all of them were household slaves. One might have been in and out of the house. But she started her marriage with good intentions of, you know, I'm a northerner. I don't necessarily like this, but it'll sure be nice to have somebody to do my laundry for me, that kind of thing. And then what she discovered as the years went by is, this girl who's maybe 15, she is the laziest girl. She won't do anything. And she finds herself slapping her, and telling her to do her work, and finds herself so frustrated. And then she gets angry at herself for these outbursts of anger toward her servants. And so you see this degradation of her as her letters, these were a series of letters to, I think, her relatives. You see this degradation in her character as we go along. And I found it very disturbing, and it was hard to read.
It is.
But
I don't think I do think that there is an arrogance in today's society, which goes back to something you were saying earlier. Is we think we would be different.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of us would, because it's not just because it was the norm, but because if you tried to be the difference, you'd be ostracized by your community.
You would. If you were in the South preaching abolition, you'd have been killed,
Yeah.
honestly. So I would imagine if somebody had those kinds of different feelings, they probably kept it to themselves and moved north.
Yeah.
Even in the North, abolitionism didn't really catch on. It was treated with scorn for many, many decades, and like the Grimke sisters, Angelica and Emily, I think Emily Grimke, who were from South Carolina, they endured a lot of taunts and threats and scorn, and traveled all around the North. And because they were women, it was doubly, difficult. They were scorned and spit at and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until really the secession crisis, starting in the 40s, and it just kept building for a couple of decades until it broke into war. It wasn't until that was starting to boil that the abolitionists really started getting support from state governments and then federal governments, and people would then throng to their speeches. But before that, no, nobody really wanted to listen to that. They wanted them to just shut up and go away. They were not the life of the party. they,
Yeah.
they were the party poopers. Yeah.
And like you're saying, it doesn't take long before your reputation around town is somebody that's not welcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. And go ahead.
what I was going to say, and sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, is that you then, as we were talking about the degradation of people and how they're seen once you start owning somebody, it doesn't take long before the sisters are not one of us. And if you're not one of us, we can drop you down a class system now. And
Right.
because you've been dropped down a class system, maybe it doesn't matter what words we use in front of you and how we speak to you. And we can lower that tone towards you. And eventually
Right.
that lowered tone becomes they'll understand they're not welcome in this town.
Wow. Yeah. Right. Right. Boy, you'd have to have a backbone of steel to be able to stand up for what you believe in. I really think there are few people today who have that backbone of steel.
Just as we're getting close to finishing, where can people find you and your work?
Well, the first place is they can go to my website, which is at www.metorrey, that's TORREY.com. And they can find where to links to find my book there, read more about it. But Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org, which in the United States anyway, supports local independent bookstores. Yeah, so your usual suspects, you can find it there.
And also, just two more questions. One is, listening to the beginning where you were talking about the breaking down of characters and stuff. If somebody was listening to this and they want to, like, how to explore a character, what would you recommend for them?
So if they have, you mean if they like have a character in mind, but how to
Well, because we were
deepen
talking
them and
about
make them
that point of view thing, but you had previously, earlier than that, had gone to the trouble of deconstructing the way people wrote and stuff like that. So somebody who's like listening to, like, what could they do if they want to learn about the point of view of characters, how to deconstruct? What would you suggest they do to learn how to do that?
I'm still a little confused with your question. Sorry. So if they want to learn how to be in a point of view
Yeah.
for a particular character, okay. So it depends on how you've chosen to narrate your novel. All
Okay.
right. And that was something that I didn't know. There's some authors, such as, I'll give you an example, like Dean Koontz, who writes horror. If you read a lot of his, he'll have a first person character. So I did this, I did that. And then he narrates the whole book through their very, very close lens. So at any time, you can hear their thoughts if that's how Kuntz is writing it at that moment. And at any time, you can see what they're seeing and hear what they're hearing or what they're saying and that kind of thing. So you don't, the camera really doesn't move too much away from them. It's always pretty much through their eyes and their ears. Um, but with now, not all of Kuntz's books are written that way, so look for those. But then there will be other authors. Trying to think of, well, I'll give Barbara Kingsolver. She did one. I think Demon Copperhead. I think that's the name of it, Demon Copperhead. And I read that one, and it's all through Demon Copperhead's perspective, and I think it's also first person. But there are times when Kingsolver pulls away quite a bit, and we might, see something that's not necessarily from Demon Copperhead's point of view. And so we get a little farther away. Now, my book, Fox Creek, I do what's called more of, I'm kind of halfway between an omniscient point of view and a close personal point of view, like the Kuntz books. So the omniscient point of view would happen something like this. At the start of a chapter, me as the author, I will speak in what's called the authorial voice. So on this day in September 43, the community wasn't particularly happy. Why? Because they'd experienced some ruinous floods. Neighbor so and so said this, while neighbor so and so said that. So I'm talking as the author. It's really my author voice.
Yeah.
Larry McMurtry, who wrote Lonesome Dove, he does an omniscient point of view like nobody's business. If you haven't read Lonesome Dove, that's a masterclass in omniscient point of view. So, me as the author, I start out that way. And then if I have a couple characters who I'm going to focus in on, let's say they're interacting for a scene, then I'll get my camera a little closer and I'll notice, oh, they're riding horses and here's where they're going. Oh, and now we're into their dialogue, and this is what they're saying. Okay, now we're in this character, and now he's looking at that character, and we're not able to hear that character's thoughts, but we're able to hear this character's thoughts and see what he sees. And if I want to switch characters, before I do, I've got to back my camera out again. Okay. Make sure your readers know we've backed out. Okay. Now we're seeing it from a distance, and now we go to the other character. And now we're in their eyes. Okay. So when you're reading books, note that if you're really interested in point of view and how that works, it's truly an art, much more than first or second or third person point of view. It's truly an art. So start noticing it, and don't go to the books that are meh. Go to books that are critically acclaimed and figure them out, and also identify what kind of stage of point of view this author has used.
Okay, I like that. That's really, because that's
Yeah.
well, it's the people. The cliche, the devil is in the detail. Is the truth? It's those details that you don't notice that make the difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my last question is just random, and it's purely my own entertainment. I want you to imagine you have a time machine. Right? The time machine is a car of your choice. What would the car be? Where would you go? And what would be playing on the radio?
Oh gosh, this is great. Oh, I would be driving a Jaguar.
Nice.
So when I lived in England, we had a 1965 light blue metallic
Oh,
Jaguar with the
beautiful.
spoke wheels.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm in my Jaguar. I'm playing Stairway to Heaven, and I'm driving to the future. I think
Nice.
I'm going to go 200 years into the future. We're going to see where we're at.
That is wonderful. Michelle, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a treat. I appreciate you. Thank you,
And,
David.
and for me, no, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much.